So this lecture is about the Renaissance, and hopefully everyone is familiar with this term and not only in the sense of knowing names of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but really this is actually a quite important time period, not necessarily in and of itself as a discrete unit, but in the effect that it has on time periods that it follows, specifically its effect for the Reformation and things of that nature. So, really, this time period of the Renaissance, it kind of gets glossed over a lot of times where people just consider it, oh, it's about this art, and we get these four guys that make these really brilliant pieces of art, and but it's much more than that. It's really focused about the idea of humanism and um, people paying a lot of attention to human potential and human achievements. In some ways, that's a reaction to the violence of religious warfare that's gone on all during the Middle Ages, and the ability of people to see themselves as separate from the church in a number of new ways. People begin to look backwards into history for inspiration, and specifically to the time periods of the Greeks and the Romans. And this forms a base of knowledge that everyone, or the idea is that this base of knowledge provided by studying the Greeks and studying the Romans creates the base of knowledge that everyone should possess. And belief that the Greeks and the Romans had a higher culture than has been achieved after the Middle Ages, and that everyone should kind of imitate parts of Greek and Roman culture. And in this imitation, it initiates changes across society in literature, in politics, art, architecture, but especially religion. And it sets the stage for the Reformation and um, kind of the Western fixation with art as a form of status and prestige. The father of the Renaissance is Francesco Petrarch. He is the man that actually coins the term the Dark Ages, and he draws a very clear distinction between the past and the modern world. Um, he translates the works of Roman political thinkers, men like Cicero, into Latin. And he argues that studying this stuff leads to a better society. And the problem is that that argument creates conflict because we're talking about studying the works of people that are pagans here, right? So these are, Petrarch and this guy over here on the other side, Ficino, these are Christians. These are Roman Catholics. And to be saying that there's really positive things coming out of the minds and philosophies of pagans is kind of problematic. And this is where Marsilio Ficini comes in because he translates the works of Plato, translates them into Latin, but he makes a concerted effort to reconcile the philosophy of Plato into Christian terms, specifically that you can understand, or maybe not understand, but begin to approach this idea of religion and God and Christianity and make it more accessible by contemplating the issue of virtue. And he argues that logic and science does not automatically create true understanding, but which is the ancients wouldn't have made the same argument. They'd have said, logic and science are these kind of definitive features of thought and learning. But these men are creating a very robust philosophy, and they're making a very serious attempt to kind of mesh the ancient world with Renaissance society. They're trying to bring the two together. And the author Dante goes one step further. He writes a, a book called The Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy is one of the greatest works of Christian literature ever created by mankind. And it's a story where he takes a trip, kind of a walking tour through hell, purgatory, and heaven. And along the way, he meets all of these people and he has this kind of spiritual experience, learns all these things. But his guide on this trip is Virgil. And we've talked about Virgil before. He's the kind of foundational figure for Rome. He's the one that escapes Troy with his father. But most importantly, Virgil is a pagan. So as Dante is approaching hell, he's kind of outside and he sees all these classic pagans, figures from the classic myths, figures from the Trojan War, and they're not being punished in the sense of we think of hell as a punishment, and they're kind of neither in hell being punished, nor are they also in God's graces, but they're kind of set aside. And Virgil is actually the one sent by God to lead Dante on this. It's not really a quest, but on this trip that he's taking. And Virgil cannot enter heaven in the final part of the Divine Comedy, but he can guide Dante. So Dante is making a very clear statement about these pagans that, yes, they are not Christians, but they are also not entirely evil in the sense that um, someone who is not Christian would be, where you would think that way about someone. There's also an effort to accumulate and study as many books as possible. And when I say accumulate, I mean hoarding in the full sense of the term. And in this time period, you begin to see people amassing libraries, and they collect all of this ancient literature, and it begins to become a kind of status symbol. And the master of this is Niccolo Nicolai, and he translates any and every piece of ancient text he can get his hands on. And we're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of volumes that are translated into Latin or Greek so that it can be accessible in the modern world. And his works actually become the kernel, the foundation for the Vatican Library. The Vatican Library, as it stands today, holds millions of volumes on all manner of different subjects. And the huge libraries that are begun in this time period are seen not just as status symbols, I mean, that's very true, but they're also seen as routes to knowledge. Now, we've talked a little bit about humanism, and it's not a one size fits all ideology. There are many different ways people begin to look at humanity and think about humans' place in the world. And one of the most famous, of course, is Machiavelli, and he argues that people are not inherently good, and that fear is actually a very good motivator for a monarch or a government, meaning that a government can do things that are kind of terrifying or horrible if the end product is justifiable. So the end goal is what is most important, and that should dictate someone's actions. Kind of literally, the ends justifies the means. And this is obviously a very dim vision of humanity. It's not really founded on the idea of uh, everyone in society is equal and everyone should have equal access to this, that, or the other. It's not the idea that we're going to ultimately improve society for the better. It's kind of a dim vision of humanity. You also have another guy, Giovanni Boccaccio, and Boccaccio is inspired very much by Dante in the fact that he writes in the common language instead of Latin. The Divine Comedy, instead of being written, Dante, instead of writing it in Latin, wrote it in Italian, and then everybody could read it. And Boccaccio kind of follows along the same way. He writes in Italian instead of Latin. And Boccaccio's stories focus on humans. So they're stories that are humorous. They're sometimes, well, a lot of times they're kind of raunchy, and they're not religious or explicitly political like a lot of the things that Dante wrote. And for Boccaccio, humanity itself, um, love and humor and all this other stuff, it's those are the subjects that he wants to write about. Now, all of this work that I've just talked about in terms of the fields of literature, it really spurs the need for a better way to transmit this information. Prior to the invention of the printing press, not everything, excuse me, let me back up. Books are written by hand. So somebody who, let's say you wanted a copy of the Bible for yourself, someone had to sit down and copy it word by word, um, the entire text. And that is an extremely exhausting, extremely expensive way of creating a book. Now, what you do end up with is each book being um, totally unique and illustrated, virtually its own little work of art. But it's not a way to transmit a lot of information from place to place very quickly. It takes a lot of time. And the result is the invention of the printing press in the mid 1400s. And the printing press, this product of Johannes Gutenberg, it basically puts a machine process to the idea of bookmaking. And the way this works is you have a series of what's called block or movable type. And you set these into a tray and you essentially create a solid copy of whatever's on the page, whatever artwork or whatever text is on the page. And then you ink it, you put it into a press, literally a press, and you manually press the hell out of it, and it transfers the ink, the image, onto a piece of paper. Now you take it out and you hang it up and you dry it. And you can see that in that center picture over there on the right-hand side. There's all these leaves of paper that are hung up almost like something on a clothesline to dry. Once everything is dry, you bind it all up and you put it in a fancy cover, and voila, you've got a book. And while that is a lot of steps and it is extremely time consuming, it is much, much faster than sitting down and having a monk somewhere copy it all out by hand. And you also have the ability to create multiple copies at one time. So you can print 200 of the same page before you move on to the next page. It makes duplication much easier. The importance of this invention, the printing press, movable type, cannot be overstated. This is one of those things that makes the modern world, even the world we live in today, possible. The biggest application of printing technology is put towards circulating all new translations of the Bible. And one of the most important versions that comes out of this, made with this new technology, this printing press, is the Greek New Testament by a man named Erasmus. Now, Erasmus also wrote a lot of philosophy where he attempted to apply Greek and Roman knowledge to modern problems and moral situations. Um, He's kind of a big philosophical thinker in this time period, but the product that he produced that had the most effect on history, I mean, right down to the very day, is his production of the Greek New Testament. Really important that you understand this. He's actually quite a figure. So he creates the Greek translation, the Greek New Testament, and this becomes the source ultimately for the Bibles of the Reformation. Martin Luther, um, kind of the father of the Protestant Reformation, uses the Greek New Testament to create the German Bible in 1522. And the Bible used by Tyndale, who goes on to create the English New Testament, becomes the base for Tyndale's English New Testament becomes the kind of foundation for all English Bibles which have come along since. But most importantly, Tyndale's Bible is where we get the Geneva Bible. It's translated into English, but it is the Bible that is used by William Shakespeare, Cromwell, And it is also the Bible that is carried to the New World by the Pilgrims. So if you think about it, you can clearly see where this is just an example of how quickly this spreads and how vastly, or yes, how the change in history can be just massive, gigantic because of the ability to transmit these ideas quickly. So there's really no way to overstate the influence of the Greek New Testament and movable print on Western civilization. Obviously, and you knew we were going to talk about it somewhere along the line, there's a change in artwork as well. There's a fixation on humanity and representation of humans instead of religious subjects extended into art, specifically painting. And you can see here these bodies are shown in a very classical style and proportion that would seem appealing and not out of place for or Romans. The Mona Lisa is one of the most famous images on the planet. It's actually not all that great in terms of um, color and etc. It's also a very small painting too. I don't know if anyone has ever seen it, but it's very small. And Caravaggio on the left-hand side there is an absolute master of proportion, form, and color. So the subjects become, whether they are kind of just basic human subjects as the Mona Lisa, or they are still religious subjects. Caravaggio is painting um, David holding the head of uh, of the conquered foe there. Whether they are a religious or not religious image, there's still a great focus on how the human body is represented. There's also a new perspective, and I mean that quite literally. And you have 1 point and 2 point perspective being used in Renaissance painting. It's one of the ways you can identify these things, actually. And 1 point perspective uses a vanishing point where an image, using the vanishing point along a fictional horizon line, it begins to make the painting, give the painting a logical sense of space, where an image looks more real. It doesn't look flat. You don't have roof lines running all over the place if you were painting a picture of a building, etc. So what you have is a horizon line, and that may be imaginary, and there's an arbitrary point somewhere along that line called the vanishing point, and everything kind of goes to that point. You can see that illustrated here. It's a very, very simple concept, and it's very easy to understand, but this is what makes this art so revolutionary. Here's probably the best example of this. This is Da Vinci's Last Supper, and the vanishing point clearly is behind Christ, kind of right behind his head. And you can see every point in the entire painting, the edges of the table, the edges of the doorways, the edges of the windows, the tray work in the ceiling, everything kind of goes to that vanishing point. But 2 point perspective. 2 point perspective uses two vanishing points along that imaginary horizon line, but it creates a very real sense of depth in any drawing or painting. And this is a good example of 2 point perspective. And this is a painting, it's the School of Athens by Raphael, the painter, not the turtle. Anyway, we see multiple lines of vanishing points for buildings, and not only the buildings and the archways and everything, but also the furniture in the room as well. So totally revolutionary. And these paintings and all of this new types of artwork, um, they become something extremely popular. Everybody wants to be part of this. When I say everybody, I mean kind of all of the powerful people want to be able to produce this artwork. So even extends to the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans actually reach out to some of these Christian Renaissance painters and architects to work on projects of their own. And this is kind of ironic considering the kind of uh, extremely negative relationship that exists between the Ottoman Empire, which is a Muslim empire, and Christianity after the Middle Ages. And it shows this wide reaching revolution in worldview and perspective. And some of these sultans hire these Renaissance painters and architects. They do beautiful work in gold leaf and produce some of the most beautiful mosaics that have ever been put inside of any church. Now, artwork becomes extremely important also as a part of politics. And the Catholic Church recognizes what is going on all around them and they get in on the action. So if you have Ottomans, Muslim sultans that are reaching out to these Christian painters to produce these works of art, clearly the Catholic Church is going to want to be doing some of the same things. The Vatican begins a huge expansion, and they throw huge amounts of money at art and architecture. One of the big projects is the construction of St. Peter's Square. It's another historical irony is it's called St. Peter's Square, but it's not square, it's round, but that's neither here nor there. But the building that I want to talk mostly about here, using an example from the Vatican, is the Sistine Chapel. And the Sistine Chapel is located inside the Vatican. It's right next to St. Peter's Basilica, right where that arrow is pointing. Pope Julius II contracts Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the chapel in 1508. And this is a gigantic project. We're talking a project that demonstrates the ability of the church to use its power to create these just marvels of art. And in the Sistine ceiling, you have what is essentially the entire story of the Bible kind of painted out all over the wall. And we're talking hundreds upon hundreds of figures. And this is designed to be extremely impressive to anyone that sees it. It's a demonstration of power. And the center piece there that you see is a work called The Creation of Adam. And it's just one of many of these pieces, panels, if you will, that go across the entire ceiling. You can see it in that. The bottom picture is a kind of wide view of the entire ceiling, and right where that arrow is pointing is where the creation of Adam is in relationship to the ceiling itself. Another pope later calls Michelangelo back in 1536 to begin painting an image of the final judgment above the altar place. And these works are almost overwhelming in scale and grandeur. And this is specifically being used to express power. Inside St. Peter's Basilica itself, this is made clear with a very important piece of artwork. And this is produced by a man named Bernini, and the piece is called the Baldacchini, and it's this kind of altar covering. It's right at the cross inside the St. Peter's Basilica. And this is an ornate gold object in the extreme. It's very Baroque, and it's literally over the top in terms of money spent, outlay, and just the sheer nature of the object itself. Not to, the best example in my mind, or not an example, but a way I can put this into modern terms is the same kind of message is being sent here with things like the Baldacchini, and this is kind of World Heritage type artwork here, but the image being sent by the people in this time, it's really no different than someone who's got gold-plated wheels on their Lamborghini Aventador. They're sending a message about wealth and power and their ability to command these kind of pieces of cultural expression. And not only just in terms of expressing how much money we can spend and how much we have the power to marshal all of these artists and have them working for us doing these unbelievably huge and impressive paintings, but it also can be used to explicitly deliver political messages as well. So back in the Sistine Chapel again, Pietro Perugino paints a panel on the wall, and you can see it on the right hand side underneath the ceiling facing the Last Judgment by Michelangelo. That painting is called The Delivery of Keys to St. Peter. And in this painting, I've got a little blow up of that painting on the left hand side there. You can see Christ himself is kind of handing the keys to St. Peter. St. Peter becoming the representation, or not the representation of, but the representative of God on earth after the death of Christ. This is literally saying that we have the authority. We have this kind of super religious authority, and they're tracing it right straight back to Christ himself. This is an overt statement of political power. So, from beginning to end in this time period, you see that the focus is not exclusively on religious matters, but rather how humanism becomes a part of this language that everyone is using at the end of during the Renaissance.